Hello, people. You are taking notes today on the 7 Years' War, which is also known as the French and Indian War. Those are interchangeable names, so remember that. So this is your background sort of lecture on this topic, but we also have some background to our background. So we need to know that by 1755, or 1754, when this war starts to begin, there are 13 distinct colonies in what will eventually become the United States. And these will be the 13 colonies that come together to declare independence a few short years later. They're divided into 3 regions. We've talked about these in class before, but these are the official sort of designations for these 13. So these 4, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, which are all in this area right here, that's New England. The next section right here in sort of the middle of this map is shockingly called the Middle Colonies. This is New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And then finally, starting with Maryland here and working its way all the way down to Georgia, we have the Southern Colonies: Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So all of these colonies by 1755 are thriving. They're doing really well. As we've discussed in class, they have been settled by Europeans who are looking for a bunch of different things: religious freedom, particularly maybe with the Puritans in New England, economic gain, particularly as these plantation economies in places like Virginia are starting to take off and become productive, creating those cash crops like rice and tobacco. And then there's an imperialistic sort of urge here as well. These settlers are in some cases looking to expand their country's influence in other parts of the world. We also have seen the introduction of slavery and the kind of thriving of slavery by the time the French and Indian War starts. Slavery comes about in the New World mostly because of the plantation economies of the southern colonies and the labor that's needed to keep those plantations running. They're growing things like rice, sugarcane, tobacco, all of which is very labor-intensive work. And they need a lot of bodies to be able to do that. If you want to pay people to do that, that means that the profits that you can make go down. So slavery becomes a very economically powerful motivator for some of these plantation owners in that part of North America. The very first slaves in America, we believe, arrived in Jamestown in 1619, only about 12 years after that colony got up and running. So slavery is very much tied to this part of the world, and we'll see that continuing influence throughout the rest of our studies this year. Slaves are not the only people who are working on some of these plantations. There's also a number of white indentured servants, people who have essentially sold themselves into this very, very hard labor, working for a manorial sort of lord, kind of modeled on the feudal European model in North America, with the idea that they're going to eventually be able to buy their freedom, set up their own farms, and make their own profits. The colonists are pretty loyal at this point. They consider themselves absolutely to be British citizens, members of the royal crown, and they consider themselves to be just as European, or maybe not as European, but just as much of as a part of the British crown as the people in Great Britain. They're a little bit difficult to govern, though, although this kind of gets worked out through a policy that will be called salutary neglect, and this is a really important term to understand. Salutary neglect is the idea that as long as the colonies are doing well and they're sending things like expensive raw materials back to Europe to be finished and turned into products that can be sold back to those same colonists as well as people in other parts of the world, the British government is maybe not going to care so much about whether those individual colonies are following all the laws of either the British Empire or their local appointed government. So the colonists, they're making money, they're doing well, and they're starting to get kind of a sense of autonomy and self-government that's going to become really important when this war, the 7 Years' War, is over. So that's a really important term to have in your notes. Just a little bit of a review about how this trade is working. We're seeing raw materials being shipped from the British colonies in North America back to Europe. We're also seeing things like molasses and rum and some of these sort of, they're not exactly finished products, but they're not exactly raw materials either. Those would be made from sugar and molasses, accordingly being shipped sort of to the West Indies here. We're seeing the slave trade kind of coming back and forth between Africa and New England and the West Indies in this part of the world. So this is often called the triangular trade, this sort of three-way economic relationship between Europe, North America, and Africa during this time. We also refer to this as the Atlantic world, which you took notes on a week or so ago. Just to give you a sense of what the map of North America looks like during this time, the British colonies, which will eventually become the United States, take up very little room of what will eventually become the United States. It's just really these sort of coastal areas here in the east. The Spanish are still in control of Florida, a lot of islands sort of here in Cuba, and areas sort of in the Bahamas, and then all of what will eventually become Mexico and parts of the American Southwest as well. France, as you can see, also has huge territorial claims. This whole area in here is called the Ohio River Valley, and that's going to be really important because that's where some tensions are going to erupt between English and French, but they also totally control the Mississippi River, and that has allowed them to kind of spread and continue to explore to the west as well. And we can still see French influence in all of these regions. So what are these tensions that I'm talking about? Why are they happening? British settlers who are in all those sort of towns and on the East Coast, they are founding towns, they're clearing the land for crops, and they're pushing further and further west. And part of this has to do with the fact that as these Puritans are in some cases claiming land. They're dividing up that land when their sons come of age and parceling it out. And these plots of land are getting smaller and smaller and smaller as the generations go on. Remember, we talked about a lot of these settlers coming in the early 1600s, and we're now talking about almost 120 years later, 150 years later in the mid 1700s. So these land claims have gotten smaller and smaller over time. But there's plenty of land to the west, so people start looking at that territory to expand into. But that territory is not necessarily up for grabs. The French settlers who are in that area have established forts at this point to protect their land claims and promote trade with the Indians. We know that the fur trade was really critical for inspiring the French to start colonizing North America, and they continue to do so throughout this time period as well. So frequently by the late 1600s, looking at like the 1690s and the early 1700s, these two groups are clashing. They're doing small kind of military skirmishes together. They're frequently at war. The French and Indian War will actually start in the colonies in 1754, and then it'll end up spreading to England, where England and France will end up fighting each other in Europe, as well as in North America. In Europe, it tends to be referred to as the 7 Years' War, which is where this other term for this war comes from. So England is going to protect its territory and protect its land claims, protect the interests of its colonists, its loyal subjects, by sending royal troops from England, plus raising some colonial militia, so calling up soldiers from these colonies who are in North America, who have probably not been born in England at this point, but are local to North America, and they put an army together to confront the French. Initially, the war goes very badly for them. They suffer a lot of sort of embarrassing defeats that make the colonists get a little bit nervous. But eventually, of course, the British Army, which is the strongest army in the world, comes together and is able to reclaim these territories and work out a peace treaty so that they not only have access to a little bit more Western land, but well, we'll see what happens next. Couple other important figures who you need to be aware of who are going to emerge out of the 7 Years' War. This guy right here, you probably recognize him. He's on a lot of our money. The young George Washington fights very early in some of the very first battles of the war as a colonial militiaman. He is not an official soldier with the British Empire. He's actually denied a military commission to become a full soldier and then get a pension and some of the other benefits of that. But this is really where he kind of cuts his teeth in terms of being in the military. We also see this guy. You probably recognize him as well. Benjamin Franklin is a somewhat young man. He's about 30 years old during the 7 Years' War. He publishes a newspaper in Philadelphia called the Philadelphia Gazette, and is sort of known as an American intellectual. He's an influential figure. Lots of people are reading his works, including this little political cartoon right here, which he publishes in 1754. This might look familiar to you if you look around my classroom. This is called the Join or Die cartoon. It is not associated with the American Revolution. It is instead associated with the 7 Years' War. Franklin was one of the first people who really suggested that the colonies, the North American colonies, should band together in order to protect themselves from Native American and French threats in the region before the British troops even showed up. So a lot of times people try to associate this with the American Revolution, but they're a little bit late on that front. The lasting impacts of this war, after the English win the war, they're going to sign a Treaty of Paris in 1763. Britain gets what will eventually become Canada out of this treaty, and it also gets lands east of the Mississippi River from France. So if you can remember back to this previous map, England is going to pretty much end up controlling all of this stuff, all the way up to the river and around. They're also going to trade Cuba to Spain in return for Florida. So we're really seeing the solidifying of British influence along the entire eastern coast of what will become the United States at this time. The Prime Minister of England at this time, William Pitt, finds himself in a lot of debt after this war is over. So he's going to raise taxes and ends up borrowing a lot of money to be able to finance the war. And after the war is over, there's still a very heavy debt that has to be repaid. And there's also some tensions that sort of emerge here between the British colonists and the Crown forces back in Europe. The Crown forces, the British back in Europe, think that the colonists haven't supported them enough. They haven't done enough in this war to protect the interests of the Crown in North America. They should have been joining more militias. They should have been more helpful to the Crown soldiers who arrived. The Americans, on the other hand, the colonists, are kind of alarmed by the British military tactics. Remember, there were some defeats early in the war, and that really makes North America feel like it's not really being very well protected by the Crown. All of that is going to set up the next war that happens, and we'll be talking about that in another week or so. Good luck with your notes.